Welcome to episode 345 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the most complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean text and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where we discuss this and all of our podcast episodes. Today, we are continuing in Cicero's academic questions. We're in Book 2, around sections 12 and 13, and we'll be diving back into the statement of Lucullus, the Stoic, who is arguing to Cicero that skeptics are wrong in their view that we can never achieve anything more than probability, and that we can never determine what is really true and false on anything. Before we go back into that, though, there's a couple of general comments I'd like to make about the significance of what we're going through here in academic questions. As we go through this, I'm reminded that the arguments that Cicero brings to bear on this question involve physics, involve epistemology, but also involve ethics and issues about the chief good and so forth, which Cicero is going to return to before we get to the end of Book 2 here. And to place that in further context, it's important to remember that Epicurus was not just some hermit out in the desert writing whatever came to his mind. Epicurus was immersed in the controversies of philosophy in his age in ancient Greece, at a time when Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, many others had established certain lines of argument that everybody was familiar with, and everybody who was in philosophy at all knew that they needed to deal with. And as a result of that, it's really important for people who want to understand what Epicurus was talking about to know the background of those arguments so that they can understand why Epicurus addressed certain topics and how he was addressing them. We've discussed that a lot, going all the way back to the beginning of the podcast, and in our work on Epicurean Friends for many years, we have frequently referred to authors like Norman DeWitt, who have stressed that much of Epicurean philosophy is a reaction to and an argument against positions that had been taken previously by Plato or others. And a book that's recently come to my attention on the same subject is Health and Hedonism in Plato and Epicurus by Kelly Aronson of Duquesne University. We'll have a lot more to say about that book in coming weeks, but I'm finding that to be extremely helpful in that she has gone through the history of the dispute between Plato and others who discussed pleasure before the time of Epicurus and lined up their arguments along with how Epicurus was responding. In our episode last week, we spent a significant amount of time with Joshua pointing out to us issues in Plato's Republic as to knowledge that were directly relevant to what we're discussing here in academic questions. In Kelly Aronson's book, she goes through other sections of the Republic and points out how they argue against pleasure in a way that is both similar and in some ways different from the arguments against pleasure that Plato gives in his Philebus. There are many aspects of that that we'll cover again in the future, but one that is directly related to what we're talking about in academic questions is that Plato is spending much of his time arguing against the use of the senses in determining truth. As we've discussed many times, Plato postulated that there are ideal forms and that we can have knowledge of these ideal forms, but not true knowledge of the things that are right in front of us, as revealed by the senses. The senses are deceptive, they're misleading, and any attempt to derive truth from what the senses provide to us is going to be doomed to failure because they simply are inadequate to the task.
Exactly. And it's also because in Plato's work, the world of sense perception is the world of the cave. It's the world of people who take the flickering shadows cast by real objects as stand-ins for those real objects because they don't know what the real objects look like. And the forms work in that same way. The forms, which exist in this realm of pure and perfect being, kind of have emanations that exist in this world, the world of sense perception, according to Plato. But what we're looking at is a second rate or third rate approximation. And it's one that is also immersed in a constant state of change and flux. And so, if you really want to get to the truth, you have to use your mind, use your wisdom, your intellect to escape this world of sense perception and go find that realm of pure and perfect being and go see those forms. And there you will see the nature of the good in its truth.
Joshua, thanks for jumping in there, because what you said is what we really need to be focusing on here. One aspect of it, particularly that you mentioned there, was the change and flux. We've been hearing about change and flux ever since Heraclitus talked about not being able to stand in the same river twice or even once when you take it to an extreme. This issue of flux was addressed also by Diogenes of Oinoander in his inscription on the wall, saying that we Epicureans acknowledge that there is a flux, but not that it is so fast that what is important to us is not perceptible by our senses. The issue of change we've been discussing in recent weeks comes in connection with these terms being versus becoming. That becoming is a reference to change, and that change is something that's not permanent, not eternal, not true. If you're changing, then you don't have truth. And what we really want from this Platonic perspective is truth, the ideal. So let's look past the changing, flickering shadows on the wall to some real truth that exists outside the cave in another world. There's going to be some great material in Aronson's book that in the future I'm going to be bringing in here. But one quotation from it that applies to this is that when she discusses how Plato brings this question to bear in the Philebus, Kelly Aronson says this, quote, "If pleasure is a process toward health rather than an end, then it belongs to the realm of becoming rather than that of being. And so it cannot, on Plato's view, qualify as good in itself. Clearly, much is at stake for the hedonist in this dispute. Plato aims to diminish the goodness of pleasure by employing a certain description of pleasure's nature," unquote. What she's saying is that if you consider pleasure to be change, if you consider pleasure to be something that's totally tied to replenishing things, if you think there has to be a lack that has to be filled before you can have pleasure, that that's all that pleasure does, then you're locking pleasure into this realm of becoming, of flux, of change. And that locks it into the realm that Plato is saying is nothing more than flickering shadows on the wall, that you are being held in chains to think that that is what is reality, because reality that is true is outside the cave. And you have to get outside the cave, away from the sensations, before you can find what's really true in the world. So even though we have not been talking completely about ethics in these discussions and academic questions, the whole issue of what something is and how you know it is related to this question of pleasure and happiness. Because again, what Kelly Aronson is pointing out is that if pleasure is something that's in flux, up and down, constantly changing, then that takes it out of the realm of being good in itself. And that's about as different from Epicurus' position as you could possibly be, because Epicurus takes a position that only pleasure is good, only pleasure is desirable in itself. So this issue of change and flux and whether you can ever know anything with certainty or whether it can only be probable are related to each other and will often determine the conclusions that you're going to reach about pleasure. We've had many discussions in the forum about this issue of kinetic and katastematic pleasure, which Kelly Aronson deals with at length in her book. And if you conclude that kinetic pleasure is the pleasure that we all recognize as that of eating, drinking, food, sex, music, rock and roll, things like that, if you conclude that those are all tied to change, then that places that category of activity in an inferior position from the word go. If what you really should be concerned about in life is that which does not change, then the implication is that you should concern yourself with those things and simply minimize any activity that takes your attention away from something that does not change. So, in her conclusion, Aronson comes to a different viewpoint about what kinetic and catastematic means. And she differs in her conclusions from other writers who've looked at this issue, like Gosling and Taylor and Nikolsky, who we've talked about in the past. She agrees with them in certain aspects, but the direction of her conclusion is that we cannot understand what Epicurus is talking about limits, about absence of pain, about kinetic or catastematic, unless we understand the arguments that Plato had been using about change and about permanency and the truth being in ideal forms rather than in the sensations. All these issues are wrapped together. And if you attempt to take one piece of the argument out of the context of discussing the whole, you're seriously endangered in your ability to understand what the whole thing is about. Aronson points out that in Republic Book 9, there's a lot of discussion about Plato's views of pleasure. And by chaining pleasure to a process of change, Plato ends up consigning the normal pleasures to an inferior status. Aronson translates Plato's Republic 585b9, and this is discussing pleasures, as saying this, quote, "Which kinds do you think partake more of pure being? Filling up with bread, drink, delicacies, and food in general? Or the kind of filling up that is with true belief, knowledge, understanding, and in some with every virtue? Judge it this way: that which clings closely to what is always the same, immortal and true, and is itself of that kind and comes to be in something of that kind. Do you think it is more than that which clings closely to what is mortal and never the same?" The basic distinction that he's drawing is the point that I'm calling attention to. He is saying that bread, drink, delicacies, and food, they are a kind of filling up that is a part of change and not of pure being. And that the pure being type of pleasure is found in true belief, knowledge, understanding, and the virtues. So there's a deep argument going on well before Epicurus ever came on the scene about the nature of pleasure and whether it involves change or whether it does not involve change, whether there's some higher type of pleasure which is above the senses and above the realm of change, the realm of becoming.
And it's worth noting that Epicurus himself takes flickering streams of change and actually makes it core to his epistemology, because this is the difference between the extramission theory of sight, or the extramission theory of vision in the ancient world, and the intromission theory of vision. The extramission theory of vision of people like Plato and Aristotle in that school was analogous to the idea that the eyes were doors to a lamp. And when the doors were opened, the light of the lamp was cast out onto the world, and the subject could see what was out there. And they had theories to account for why, if it's a kind of light, doesn't it light up dark rooms that the person is standing in, etc.? I don't want to go too deep into it. The point is that this theory has been totally discredited now, but it was rivaled in the ancient world by a view held by the atomists called the intromission theory. And the intromission theory wasn't really solved until Ibn al-Haytham, who is credited with solving the problem of vision as reflections of light and so on. But for Epicurus, it was emanations, films that were being cast off by the objects themselves and that flew through the air to strike the eyes and to strike the soul of the person who's seeing the thing. It's streaming into the person, giving them vision, rather than streaming out and giving them vision. So in the extramission theory, you could say that you're looking out at something that is unchanging, if you could find any such thing that was visible to the eyes. But with the intromission theory, change is how the system works in the first place. If there was no change, vision would not even be possible. We're going to have to find a way to continue to bring out that issue and issues like that as we go through this text, and finally into Philodemus on signs or on methods of inference.
People need to realize that the whole atomist framework is a discussion of atoms moving through the void constantly. Plato and Aristotle and these guys who are talking about ideal forms and unchanging immortal things and so forth, they're rejecting atomism. They think that atomism is bunk. And they therefore don't approach things from the idea that everything is essentially in motion all the time, that there's no bottom or there's no center of the universe at which anything can come to rest. So, absolutely, the reliance of Epicurus on the motion of particles through space as the basis and foundation for the senses is exactly what Lucretius talks about in Book 4 of his poem. And it's essential to understanding Epicurus's whole approach to things. He's not looking for anything immortal and eternal except the atoms themselves. Only the atoms are unchanging. But everything that comes together from the atoms, comes together into bodies, is constantly changing. And that is not a demerit to bodies. It's just a fact of nature, that that's how things work. And we're not going to reject the way nature works. We're going to embrace the way nature works if we want to use nature as the standard for understanding the best way to live. Now, one more thing I want to cite from Aaronson that Joshua may have a better background on than I do. But continuing in the Republic, Aaronson points out that Plato ends up holding that the philosopher's pleasure outranks the profit lover or the honor lover or other types of lives, not because the philosopher's pleasure feels better in any sensation aspect, but because the philosopher alone has true access to being, to this immortal realm of ideas at which this highest pleasure is supposed to be graded. And one of the conclusions he reaches because of this analysis is he concludes that the philosopher king lives 729 times more pleasantly than does the tyrant. And Aaronson, I'm going to quote from her rather than Socrates here in describing this conclusion. Aaronson says, Socrates' comparison of the qualitative pleasure of the kingly and tyrannical lives is so over the top as to be utterly ridiculous. In Plato's calculation in Book 9, there's in fact no pleasure units. Socrates arrives at 729 by first counting the tyrant's distance from the king in the ranking of psychic constitutions, and then performing some squaring and cubing, unquote. So again, getting back to where we are in the overall scheme of things, Epicurus was confronted with the primary philosophical position being that pleasure is something that is part of the realm of darkness that we're chained to in the cave, that as such, it should not be looked upon as good in itself at all, and our focus should be on things that are outside the cave, the realm of ideal forms and so forth. And of course, what I've just said there, that's the issue that we're discussing in academic questions. What is the role of sensation in understanding what's true and real and what we should really be concerned about? Epicurus rejects the Platonic analysis because he rejects the idea that the sensations are lying to us, that they're misleading us. And of course, the way he does that is he points out the sensations are always honestly reporting what it is they receive. That error is not in the senses, but in the opinions that we reach from processing the information given to us by the senses. And one last practical application of this dispute that I want to be sure to point out is this. If you take Plato's position that only being, only ideal forms counts as real knowledge and as truth, then true happiness and anything else is available only to the person who's capable of contacting this realm of ideal forms. That would mean, if it were true, that only the philosopher has the ability to live a truly happy life. Everybody else is simply left with nothing but shadows on the wall, something that's only a fraction of the pleasure that a philosopher is supposedly able to access through this logical, geometrical, abstract process of dialectic that they hold to be the source of truth. So what ends up being at stake here, when we debate whether a real person has access to the truth or not, whether the senses allow us to have access to the truth, or whether we have to be geometricians or something even worse in order to understand what the truth is, The real issue involved is not just whether we have access to true or false, but whether we have access to the best way of life, to true pleasure, true happiness, true health, or not. Whether we as normal people are able to get the best things in life, or whether it is totally foreclosed from us by the fact that we're not at the same league as Socrates, Plato, and Pythagoras, and the type person who thinks they can calculate pleasures to 729 times to reach something that they think is correct. So, what's actually at stake in the end is whether pleasure and happiness can belong to everyone, any normal person, or only to the few, like Socrates and Plato, who allege that they have some special knowledge through dialectic. Even the Stoics, as we've been discussing, equivocate as to whether true knowledge is even accessible to the sage. We've been quoting the statement that the sage is apparently as rare as the phoenix. So, what we're fighting about when we're fighting about knowledge is whether the lives that we can lead as regular people are the best lives that are possible, or whether we are simply locked in a cave forever in an inferior world, in which we should look to these Platonist philosophers or to religion or to other esoteric types of knowledge for the truth. Epicurus rejects all that, and that's what we're going to be continuing to discuss as we go through the remainder of academic questions.
Well, I know you haven't finished Aronson's book, and I haven't even started Aronson's book. So, as you told me this morning, I think we're going to wait to go too much further into some of this in detail until we have some more clarity on where she comes in the end of her argument in that book. So, for now, I'm happy to return to section 13 in academic questions. So, in section 10, Lucullus had said, "Those men who affirm that nothing can be comprehended take away by their assertion all these instruments or ornaments of life, or rather, I should say, utterly overturn the whole of life, and deprive the animal itself of mind, so that it is difficult to speak of their rashness as the merits of the case require." And by these instruments or ornaments of life, he is talking about sense perception. He is talking about art and philosophy and virtue. Virtue above all, to which single thing all life is subordinate. And those who say that nothing could be comprehended are making it impossible to live according to virtue. And it's for that reason that they're making it utterly impossible to live at all, really. He does say at the end of section 10, "But others defend themselves more elegantly, who complain also that we accuse them of calling everything uncertain. And they endeavor to explain how much difference there is between what is uncertain and what cannot be perceived. Let us then now deal with those who draw this distinction, and let us abandon as incurable and desperate those who say that everything is as uncertain as whether the number of the stars be odd or even. For they contend that there is something probable and, as I may say, likely, and that they adopt that likelihood as a rule in steering their course of life and in making inquiries and conducting discussions." And it is into this latter category of skeptic that Cicero himself falls. And so section 11 opened his treatment of this second class of skeptics with his discussion of marks or signs, the little things by which we identify what is true and what is false, and how we perceive the difference between them, and that there is a difference in the first place. And section 12, which we discussed last week, brought up this question of assent. While other sentient beings, lower orders of animals, for example, are incapable of epistemic assent, and they just have to take everything that they see or hear or taste or touch or smell basically as it is presented to them without the ability to grant or withhold assent. Humans fall into the category of those who possess minds that are capable of furnishing or withholding assent when confronted with information from the senses. He says in the last paragraph of section 12, he says, "What is most important of all is that although some things may be in our power, yet they will not be in the power of that man who assents to nothing. Where then is virtue if nothing depends on ourselves? But it is above all things absurd that vices should be in the power of the agents, and that no one should do wrong except by deliberate consent to do so, and yet that this should not be the case with virtue. all the consistency and firmness of which depends on the things to which it has assented and which it has approved. And altogether, it is necessary that something should be perceived before we act and before we assent to what is perceived. Wherefore, he who denies the existence of perception or assent puts an end to all action in life. And then as we come to section 13 for today, we're going to see a shift away from this question of consent and toward the arguments that are presented by these skeptics, by these probabilists, to coin a term there, to examine the arguments that are advanced by these skeptics who say that, well, nothing is known, but we could say that some things are probable. And Lucullus is going to try to deal with them in advance before Cicero takes over and responds in full detail to all of the points that Lucullus is making now. So that's where we are as we go into section 13 for today. Now, for clarity's sake, we are going to be reading today from the Rackham translation. This is the Loeb edition. Typically, we read from the Young translation, but there's a very tricky and important sentence that Young seems to translate rather poorly, or perhaps it's just formatted poorly. I can't really tell. But we'll be doing Rackham today. So in section 13, Lucullus says this. Now, let us examine the arguments usually advanced by this school on the other side. But before that, this is an opportunity for you to learn the foundations of their whole system. They begin by constructing a, quote, science of presentations, as we render the term, and define their nature and classes, and in particular, the nature of that which can be perceived and grasped at as great a length as do the Stoics. They then set out the two propositions that hold together the whole of this investigation. The first proposition, when certain objects present an appearance of such a kind that other objects also could present the same appearance without there being any difference between these presentations, it is impossible that the one set of objects should be capable of being perceived and the other set not capable. But, and this is the second principle, not only in a case in which they are alike in every particular is there no difference between them, but also in a case in which they cannot be distinguished apart. Having set out these propositions, they include the whole issue within a single syllogistic argument. This argument is constructed as follows. Some presentations are true, others are false. What is false cannot be perceived. But a true presentation is invariably of such a sort that a false presentation also could be of exactly the same sort. And among presentations of such a sort that there is no difference between them, it cannot occur that some are capable of being perceived and others are not. Therefore, and this is the conclusion of the argument, there is no presentation that is capable of being perceived. Okay, so that's the central argument. Lucullus is about to talk about the premises that were required to build that argument. But before we go to that, in the Rackham version of this text, there is a footnote on page 518 of the Loeb edition that attempts, for the layman like me and Cassius, to explain this rather difficult argument here. So let me read that. Quote, two objects entirely alike, A1 and A2, present the same appearance A. But so also do two objects only superficially alike. Though not really alike entirely, they are indistinguishable by the senses. X and Y both present the same appearance, X. We may have the presentation X and think it comes from X when it really comes from Y, X not being there. In this case, we do not perceive X. Therefore, when we have the presentation X and think that it comes from X and X is there, we cannot be said to perceive X. Therefore, perception is impossible. And I should clarify that X and Y in that example are capitalized, but the appearance of X is lowercase, which I think it's easier to understand if you look at it visually. That's the core of the argument.
Joshua, if that's the core of the argument, it's about as clear as mud. You see an essential point here that's being asserted other than that no perception is ultimately reliable?
Well, let's work through it and see what we can pull out of it here, because some of it is probably worth talking about, and it's going to be important as we go through the text also. So, another feature of having switched from the Young version of the text to the Rackham version of the text is Rackham tries to be very clear about a distinction that was entirely invisible to me, Cassius, until you pointed out this vocabulary. But as we've gone through this, it's become clear that when we use the word present or presentation in this Rackham version of the text, this is not a synonym of perception. He says, as the first principle, when certain objects present an appearance of such a kind that other objects also could present the same appearance without there being any difference between these presentations, it is impossible that the one set of objects should be capable of being perceived and the other set not capable. If I'm looking at this object and it is presenting an appearance, I am perceiving the appearance of that object. And if you have two such objects, and these objects are alike in every particular, and they produce the same representation, the same appearance, it would be impossible for us to say that one of these objects can be perceived while the other one cannot, because they present the same face.
Is that not what he's ultimately saying? That two different objects can present the same appearance, and we are going to perceive both of those appearances, even though the objects are different.
Here's the thing. You can have a case where two objects present the same appearance and they are the same. They have the same reality. But you can also have a case where two objects present the same appearance, but they don't have the same reality. Now, in either case, you could say that the appearance of both of them is capable of being perceived. Or you could say that the appearance of both of them is not capable of being perceived. What you can't say is that the appearance of just one of them is capable of being perceived, and the appearance of the other is not capable of being perceived. That is true for both groups. I think this is going to be important when we get to the syllogism.
Yeah, and isn't this directed at this issue that the Stoics are saying that there's a type of impression that cannot be otherwise but true?
That's exactly right. We talked about that in sections 11 and 12.
You would expect two things that are the same to present the same impression, and you would be right. But you cannot eliminate the fact that something that is different may present the very same impression. And in that case, if you accept that impression, you're wrong.
Exactly, yeah. And this brings up interesting problems related to counterfeiting, for example, right? I think it was Thomas Aquinas who said that the church cannot tolerate the spread of false ideas for the same reason that the state cannot tolerate the spread of counterfeit currency. Now, he was partially riffing on something that St. Augustine had said, that the church cannot tolerate the spread of false ideas for the same reason that the state cannot tolerate the sale of poisoned bread. You can't allow this kind of harm to come to people. People have to be able to distinguish between what is true and what is false. But of course, the skeptic position is you can't distinguish between what is true and what is false. And this syllogism is in service of that position. Let me go over the syllogism one more time here, just so we're clear where we're talking about. Quote, some presentations are true, others are false. So when an object presents an appearance, some of those appearances are true, others are false. What is false cannot be perceived, but a true presentation is invariably of such a sort that a false presentation also could be of exactly the same sort. And among presentations of such a sort that there is no difference between them, it cannot occur that some are capable of being perceived and others are not. Therefore, there is no presentation that is capable of being perceived. This is the process by which they attempt to prove not only that a given appearance or a given representation cannot be perceived or cannot be thought to correspond to a reality in that object. This is the syllogism that they use to undermine the whole project of epistemology, saying that no presentation is capable of being perceived.
And in our everyday Epicurean terminology, that means that no sensation we ever receive can be trusted.
I think that's right. I think that's where they're going here.
which Epicurus handles by saying, you're wrong. There's not a question of truth in the senses at all. All sensations are honest and have to be accepted. And we're going to build our opinion about what is true and false on our analysis of these sensations. We're not going to get rid of them and say that they're lying to us. That's the Epicurean position on it. The Stoics are going to say, well, no, I'm not going to take that position that all sensations are reported honestly. I'm going to just say that some perceptions are so clear that they cannot be otherwise but true.
Yeah, it's very important to remember that all the way back in section 7, I think it was, of book 2 of Academic Questions, Lucullus started with sensation, and then he said something to the effect that he was not, like Epicurus, going to give an answer for every illusion or apparent illusion or every possible problem with sensation. That Epicurus feels the need to do this, but that Lucullus is only concerned with some sensations. He's only concerned with some appearances of what he's looking at. The exact quote he says in section 7, nor while speaking on this topic need you wait while I reply to the illustration drawn from a bent oar or the neck of a dove. For I am not a man to say that everything which seems is exactly of that character of which it seems to be. Epicurus may deal with this idea and with many others, but in my opinion, there is the very greatest truth in the senses if they are in sound and healthy order, and if everything is removed which could impede or hinder them. And he goes on to say throughout this that some sense perceptions are so clear that the object perceived cannot be otherwise than truly represented by the perception.
Joshua, that may be the place where we need to think about coming to an end for today's episode. This is a complicated material, but referring back to where we started the podcast today, it's extremely complicated, but it's extremely important because this is not just tea party debate about something that makes no difference. This is debate about whether the senses, including feelings of pleasure and pain, can ever be trusted. If you can't trust your feelings, your senses, the things that you have access to through nature, then you're forever trapped in this cave, which these guys are going to tell you they have the ability to get out of, and you should listen to them about how you live your life. Because as long as you're just chained inside this darkness, you're feeling around and have no ability to determine what's true and what's false, what's right and what's wrong, what's truly pleasurable or truly painful. They're keeping you locked in darkness through this kind of word game about whether reality can really be perceived or not. So let's go ahead and close for today. I know you probably have some final thoughts to bring it all together. So where do you think we end up for today?
Well, unfortunately, where we end up is in the middle of this section, which we've tried to avoid up to this point, at least in the reading as we go through it. This has been a very complex and difficult portion, and I cannot overemphasize the poor job that Jung does with this passage, because that's where we started, and it was completely indecipherable. So thankfully, we have Rackham to help us as we go through this, but I think it's just going to take time to understand the argument being made, and it's going to take time also to formulate a response to the argument being made. Because as we go into it next week, we're going to be, as I said, we're going to be talking about what Lucullus identifies as the underlying premises of this syllogism. And so that is going to present an opportunity to better understand some of what's happening here and how we can respond to it.
I think you're right. It's interesting that we are still and will be for a while in this Stoic section in which the Stoics are actually attempting to defend the possibility of knowledge and the possibility of concluding right from wrong that Epicurus would, to some extent at least, agree with. So the arguments that we're going to be seeing over the next several weeks are at least somewhat on the same side as the Epicurean position. So hopefully, between Rackham, Jung, and perhaps other sources we can come up with, we can get more of a grasp on this, because it's important to understand the arguments and maybe more important to understand the conclusions and implications. So we'll do our best to bring those out over the next several weeks as we go through this. Unfortunately, we're out of time for today. As always, we invite everyone to drop by the Epicurean Friends Forum and let us know if you have any questions or comments about our discussions of Epicurus. We'll be back next week and continue discussing section 13. Thanks for your time today. We'll be back again soon to do that. See you then. Bye.